Welcome to Snail's Story, where love is told slowly and always from the heart. Some stories begin with the smallest things, a bowl of hot soup on a cold night, or an invitation that was never planned. Today's story is just like that. A single mother. Struggling to hold her life together, a stranger standing at her door in the middle of a snowy night, and a 7-year-old girl with a heart big enough to open more than just the door. From one shared dinner, they slowly wove a bond that had no name but in time became something we all long for. Family, if you believe that small acts of kindness can lead to miracles, then this story is meant for you. So lean in and listen to the very end. And if it warms your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to help spread this slow and gentle love to others too. Asterisk, the late December sky hung heavy, and snow had begun to fall quietly, like a thin blanket covering the city of Boston as it tiptoed into New Year's Eve. The old streets of the South End gradually lit up with strings of lights draped from balconies, glittering on the snow like fragments of beautiful memories. People hurried home, arms wrapped around paper bags filled with bread, bouquets wrapped in newspaper, and the soft laughter of families trailing behind their footsteps. Amid that warmth, Declan Hart sat alone on a stone bench outside a small basement soup shop tucked beneath a red brick building. His long overcoat, faded with time, was still buttoned neatly. Dark leather gloves gripped his frozen fingers tightly. Resting on his knees was an old notebook, its cover damp from the snow, open to a blank page. There was nothing to write, and no one left to write to. He used to have everything. The celebrated creative director of one of the East Coast's most prestigious media firms, once featured on magazine covers, once dubbed the man who told stories with light. But those same lights that once shone on him had burned him down. When the scandal broke a year ago, a failed project, unverified rumors, and finally, a resignation announced by someone else, not by him. Since then, he'd vanished from public view, and no one asked after him anymore. Declan stared at the warm glow coming from the low glass window of the soup shop. Inside, a few rustic wooden tables were still occupied. The scent of caramelized onions and butternut squash drifted out into the cold, making his stomach ache with hunger. But he remained still, as though the biting cold was a punishment he deserved, until a small voice, clear and sweet, like silver bells in a snowstorm, rang out beside him. "Mister, do you want to eat soup with me and my mom? It's really warm." Startled, Declan turned. A little girl, around 7, with soft brown curls and cheeks pink from the cold, stood before him. She wore a green coat with frayed edges. Watercolor stains marked the cuffs, perhaps from painting. Her big, bright blue eyes looked at him without hesitation, without pity, just pure sincerity. One hand held a paper bag with the soup shop's logo, the other stretched toward him invitingly. Declan blinked, for the first time in many months. He didn't know what to say. "My mom makes it better than the store," the girl added, eyes lighting up as if it were the most obvious truth. Before Declan could refuse or even hesitate, the girl stepped forward, gently took his gloved hand with her small, cold fingers, and tugged him to stand. Strangely, his legs didn't resist. He rose, letting himself be led almost as if he were being taken home. "What's your name, mister?" she asked as they crossed the small path leading down to the basement stairs. "Declan," he said softly. "And yours?" "Rosie, I'm 7. Mom says I talk too much, but she always listens anyway." Her words brought the first smile to Declan's face in weeks. Fleeting and thin like mist, but real. Their basement apartment was tucked beneath a spiral iron staircase. The door was painted a faded blue, and above it hung a wreath made of dried pine dotted with gold-painted pine cones. Rosie knocked 3 times, then called out, "Mom, I brought a guest." The door swung open. A woman in her early 30s. with chestnut hair loosely tied to one side and a delicate face tinged with weariness, stood in the doorway. She paused for a brief second when she saw Declan, her eyes flickering with a trace of caution. He looked really cold and sad, so I asked him to come eat soup with us. Is that okay, Mom? Rosie said quickly, as if afraid of rejection. The woman Camille studied Declan for another moment. Then she nodded and gently stepped aside, opening the door wider. Please, come in. Tonight's soup is butternut squash with grilled cheese toast, if you don't mind. Declan stepped inside, feeling as though he had just left a gray world and entered a place with firelight. The apartment was small, with a low ceiling. Watercolor paintings were pinned along the walls, and the dining table sat by a low window, where the twinkling lights reflected off the scratched wooden floor. The smell of squash, cinnamon, and melting cheese softened something inside him quietly. Rosie hopped into a chair and pointed to the empty one beside her. This is your seat, Mr. Declan. It's the special one. Declan glanced toward Camille, as if to ask again for permission. But she was already placing a bowl of soup in front of him. It was warm orange, steaming, sprinkled with pepper and a few strands of fresh cilantro. Go ahead and sit. Here, we don't stand on ceremony. And just like that, on a night when Declan thought he would sit alone in the dark, he found himself eating a bowl of hot soup with two strangers. They didn't ask where he came from or who he used to be. They simply said, "You're here, and we're inviting you to stay." The basement apartment was smaller than Declan had imagined, but warmer than any place he had been to in the past year. There were no high ceilings or soundproof windows, but there was a soft yellow glow from a star sky-shaped lamp, the scent of cinnamon from bread toasting in the oven, and the cheerful voice of a 7-year-old girl telling stories to her stuffed cat in the corner of the room. Declan sat on a low wooden chair by the dining table, his knees higher than usual. The tiny table wobbled slightly, but its surface was clean and covered with a hand-embroidered tablecloth, decorated with carrots and little bears. On the wall hung dozens of watercolor paintings, likely Camille's, featuring landscapes, human figures, and abstract swirls of unnamed emotions. In the far corner stood a short wooden bookshelf, where a few old books lay beside a box of crayons and a one-eared stuffed bear. Need more pepper for the soup? Camille asked, while ladling another bowl for herself. Declan shook his head gently. No, it's warm enough. Camille sat across from him, carefully placing a spoon for Rosie before starting on her own. No one talked much. In those first few minutes, there was only the soft sound of soup being sipped, the crunch of bread being bitten, and Rosie's chattering about school, how she won a drawing contest but didn't receive the prize because the teachers thought Mommy was too good at drawing. So they said, maybe Mommy helped me. Camille chuckled lightly and looked up at Declan, slightly embarrassed. She tends to make things up. I never interfere with her contests, but I'm telling the truth, Rosie protested, not forgetting to stuff another piece of bread in her mouth, chewing with delight. Declan smiled, feeling something different. Not awkward, not formal. More like being part of a dinner where no one had to prove who they were. After the meal, Camille washed dishes in the small sink near the window, while Declan quietly remained at the table. Rosie busied herself, fetching her box of crayons and laying out drawing paper on the floor. Mr. Declan, sit here. Am I even worth drawing? Am I even worth drawing? Your eyes look sad like the street cats, but I'll add orange to make them happy. Her words made Camille glance over, still drawing a dish. Her gaze softened after a flicker of surprise. She sees more than most adults do. Declan watched Rosie color, her hair falling over half her face. The little girl didn't seem afraid of strangers. Didn't seem like she grew up in hardship. Yet every word she said felt like it came from somewhere that had learned to be stronger than it. Should have had to be. How long have you two lived here? Declan asked softly, not wanting to disturb the quiet. 2 years. Before that, a few different places. I freelance, so we moved a lot. But this is the one, Rosie said. The bread here smells better than anywhere else, so we stayed. Declan nodded slightly, eyes drifting to the subtle marks of time on the walls, chipped paint, crayon lines at child height, patches fixed with handmade paper art. A place that was ordinary, imperfect, but honest. Are you an artist? Camille smiled, resting her chin in her hand. Not exactly. I studied fine arts, had a few small exhibitions, but all that stopped when Rosie came along. Now, I illustrate children's books, sometimes hand-make greeting cards for the shop at the corner. Still painting though, but it's different. Now I don't paint to be seen, I paint so I don't disappear. That sentence made Declan fall silent. He understood. More than anyone, he understood. Outside, the night had deepened. Snow was still falling, soft as salt, ash forming a thin layer on the windowpane. Rosie had dozed off on the rug, arms wrapped around her crayon box, her unfinished drawing smudged with fingerprints. Declan stood, intending to excuse himself. Camille tucked an old fleece blanket over Rosie, then turned back to him and said gently, "You can stay a bit longer, if you'd like. The snow's still heavy out there." "I don't want to intrude." "You're not. If Rosie brought someone home without being asked, that usually means she picked right." Declan sat back down, not because he had to, not because of some schedule, but because, for the first time in months, he truly didn't want to leave. "This feels strange to me. I'm not used to having dinner with strangers, especially not being invited without a reason." Camille handed him a small cup of tea. Ginger tea, gently steeped, fragrant, and warm. "I used to feel that way too, till I realized some of the most precious things in life begin with what's not planned." Declan looked at Camille's hands wrapped around the teacup. Her fingers bore faint paint stains, her nails slightly chipped. "Pa." Her eyes carried a gentleness that was entirely unforced. "Thank you for the soup and for this room." Camille smiled without replying. Her eyes wandered from Rosie sleeping soundly to the snow falling outside the small window. No more words were needed. Yet the silence didn't feel heavy, felt like a soft blanket draped over 3 strangers, binding them together in quiet warmth. That night, Declan couldn't remember what time he left the apartment. All he remembered was the faint warmth of ginger tea still lingering in his hands, and something in his chest beginning to thaw like snow melting silently beneath the flame of a candle. The basement apartment had fallen into a hush. Only the ticking of the wooden clock on the wall remained, along with the faint sound of wind slipping through the low window pane. Rosie was fast asleep in an old fabric-covered armchair, her head resting against the armrest, one hand still clutching the box of crayons as if it were a precious treasure she couldn't let go. Her light curls were tousled, falling over her rosy cheeks. Camille gently pulled a thin wool blanket over her daughter, then quietly sat down in the chair across from Declan, holding 2 steaming cups of tea, chamomile and ginger. "I usually drink it late at night when I no longer have the energy to think about tomorrow." Declan took the cup. Their fingers brushed for a moment, brief light, but enough to unsettle him. He looked around the room once more, as if to ground himself in a place that felt so foreign, so different from the luxury apartment he used to live in, from the glittering parties filled with champagne and empty smiles. Everything here was small, worn, but not a single thing felt fake. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked after a pause. "Letting someone like me into your home, especially when it's just the 2 of you?" Camille didn't rush to answer. She sat up straight, tilted her head slightly, still watching Rosie, as if reading the answer from her daughter's steady breathing. "I used to be afraid. But then I realized you can live your whole life in fear, or you can accept that there will be moments when you have to trust someone. Today, Rosie trusted you. And she's rarely wrong. Her words left Declan speechless. He looked down, stirred his tea with a small spoon, his hand trembling not from cold, but from something else. Emotion. He wasn't used to unconditional trust, especially not from someone who had no idea who he was. "You don't know who I used to be, do you?" Camille shrugged. "I don't. But I know you're the only one Rosie has ever pulled into our home without hesitation." Declan looked up. Their eyes met. She wasn't smiling, wasn't scrutinizing him, just offering the quiet gaze of someone who had been through enough to recognize what was real and what was just armor. He took a deep breath, then spoke softly. "I used to be the creative director of a major media company. I thought I had it, all fame, money, power. But then, one mistake or maybe a push from behind, and I lost everything. The media ran with it. People turned away. Friends stayed silent. I resigned, disappeared." Camille said nothing. She simply placed her teacup on the table, leaving space for him to go on. "I drifted between cities. It's the same everywhere. People only remember who you were, not what's left of you. I thought I'd grown used to the loneliness. But today," his voice faltered, "today someone offered me soup. And I felt afraid. Because suddenly, there was a place too warm, too kind, and I was scared I didn't deserve it." Camille looked straight at him. After a moment, she said softly, but firmly, "No one needs to deserve a bowl of soup, Declan." He gave a quiet, sorrowful laugh, but something in that laugh cracked. "A shard of ice, a thin layer of defense, and you," he asked. "What did you dream of before life turned out like this?" Camille didn't answer right away. She poured more hot water into her cup, her movements slow, like she was rewinding an old memory. "I used to want to open a tiny art studio, a place to paint and teach children how to tell their stories through color. I thought that if I painted beautifully enough, honestly enough, someone would see me. But then I met Rosie's father." Declan said nothing, as if already sensing the rest. He was a professor at the art school, 10 years older. Said all the right things to a second-year student who didn't know better. When I told him I was pregnant, he just went silent and disappeared. She gently picked a fallen strand of hair from the table. Her voice, "Even my family was disappointed. My mother cried. My father said, 'You chose wrong, now you deal with it.' I left home with 2 suitcases, a 4-month belly, and a dream folded away. But not once have I regretted keeping Rosie." Her voice was as still as water. "I've done all kinds of work. Freelance illustrations, kids' art classes, making coffee, washing dishes. There were nights when I was bone-tired, but just watching her sleep gave me enough reason to keep going. I don't need pity, but sometimes I do get tired." Declan tightened his grip on the teacup. He couldn't find the words. Some kinds of strength didn't need praise, just acknowledgement in silence. "Are you angry?" he asked. "At them? At him? At the world?" Camille gave a soft laugh, light but tinged with bitterness. "Of course, Ty, but I've learned this. Anger eats away at me more than it punishes anyone else. The world isn't fair. No one's going to apologize. For that, all I can do is learn to live like putting on an extra coat in winter. I just don't complain about the cold anymore." That sentence lingered in Declan's mind. He looked at her, eyes glassy not from fleeting emotion, but from the feeling of finally being seen. No judgment, no one asking, "What's your next step?" No pity, just this: "You're here." In a small room, with a woman who once folded away her dream, but never her kindness. Rosie stirred in her sleep. Camille turned to look at her, then got up and gently pulled the blanket back over her small feet. "I don't know where you'll go after tonight, but if there's ever a moment when you feel cold, this place still has tea, paintings, and a little girl who asks way too many questions. Declan stood, slipping back into his coat. "Thank you for not asking what I needed, just for offering me soup." Camille nodded, saying nothing more, and as Declan stepped out of the basement apartment, his footsteps no longer felt as heavy as when he arrived. The wind was still cold, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely lost. The next day, the snow had stopped. The sky was a pale gray, like a thin blanket draped over a waking Boston on New Year's morning. On the streets, people hurriedly packed away string lights, took down wreaths, stored away holiday sale signs, and began easing back into the bustle of routine life. But in the small basement apartment tucked in a corner of the South End, the world seemed to move a little slower. Rosie woke up in her mother's arms, her blue eyes still hazy with sleep, then suddenly sat up as if remembering something important. "Mom, where's Mr. Declan?" Camille smiled and brushed her daughter's hair. "He probably went home, sweetheart. He only came for dinner, remember?" Rosie pouted, clutching her one-eared stuffed cat. "But I didn't get to give him the drawing." "I finished." Camille hugged her close and said nothing more. In her heart, she told herself, someone like Declan with that weathered look in his eyes and that slightly worn long coat wouldn't come back. He came like a fleeting moment in the night, and like morning snow, would melt away. But she was wrong. 2 days later, while Camille was taping up the wobbly leg of an easel with brown duct tape, there came a knock at the door. Soft. Exactly 3 times. Just like the way Rosie always knocked. She opened the door and stood still. Declan was there. No suitcase, no flowers, no wine. Just a small box of pastries wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple red string. He didn't say hello or offer an explanation. He simply smiled and said, "The bakery on the corner just pulled out a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls. I remembered Rosie said they made the sky feel warm." Camille tilted her head, lips pressed together as if hiding something she didn't ask. "Why did you come back?" Or say, "You didn't have to." She just opened the door and stepped aside quietly. "Come in. Those are best while they're still warm." From that day on, Declan started dropping by, not regularly, not on a schedule. Just every now and then when Camille was cutting paper, when Rosie was glued to a cartoon, or when the oven began releasing the buttery scent of rising cookies. He never came empty-handed. One day, it was an old storybook with a frayed cover picked up from a second-hand shop near the train station. Another day, a bag of red apples. Sometimes just a new light bulb to replace the one in the kitchen that kept flickering. Camille never asked why, but she always poured a third cup of tea, set out an extra spoon, or added another portion to the pot. One time, as Camille wrestled with a leaky kitchen faucet, Declan walked in holding a toolbox. He knelt beneath the sink and muttered, "This kitchen deserves better than this. You know how to fix pipes? Nope, but I know how to watch YouTube, and I like the feeling of being useful." They never put a label on what was forming between the 3 of them, but everything settled in so naturally. It didn't need explaining. Rosie started calling him Dad Declan when talking to her stuffed cat. Camille never corrected her. She just smiled. One day, Rosie brought home a school assignment. Draw your home. Her drawing showed 3 people standing under a slanted roof. One man with sad eyes and a pointy chin. One woman holding a paintbrush. And one little girl holding a cinnamon roll. Camille was speechless when she saw the drawing stuck to the fridge. She didn't know when exactly that figure had quietly entered their family portrait. One afternoon, while Camille was struggling to climb a ladder to replace the hallway light bulb, Declan took it from her, his brows furrowed. "Please don't climb this thing when no one's holding it, okay?" "I've climbed ladders while 7 months pregnant." "Declan?" "Yeah. Well, now you have me." The words slipped out, and both of them froze. Declan paused mid-motion. Camille stood below, looking up, not smiling, but her expression had softened. Neither of them corrected what had been said. No one backtracked. Because deep down, they both knew something had taken root. Something that didn't need a name. Once, Camille accidentally left her sketchbook on the kitchen counter. Declan opened it while waiting for the water to boil. On the first page was a sketch of a man sitting by a window holding a cup of tea, with a little girl sleeping next to him, her head on his shoulder. The lines were simple, but full of feeling. In the corner of the page, written in tiny letters, were the words, "Thank you for coming back." When Camille returned to the kitchen, the sketchbook was closed, and Declan smiled. He said nothing. That evening, as Declan was about to leave, Rosie tugged on his coat and handed him a new drawing. "I drew you as a superhero. But you don't fly, you just make cookies and fix light bulbs. But you're our home superhero." He took the picture, feeling as if something gently squeezed his heart. He had never felt that useful before. Camille stood in the doorway, a dish towel still in her hand, watching the scene. Something inside her softened. She was no longer the woman who kept strangers at arm's length. She knew she had known for a while, now that Declan was no longer a stranger. He didn't come to help. He came because this place had become a part of him, and from that day on, Camille kept a large men's raincoat by the door. Not because rain was in the forecast, but because she believed he would come back. That day, the snow returned thick and soft, falling straight down as if someone were sprinkling white powder over the Boston sky. Cold wind slipped through the cracks in the door, prompting Camille to roll up a rug and wedge it beneath the entrance to block the draft. In the kitchen, she was making white bean stew with vegetables, a dish Rosie had once named for the days when snow just won't stop. Meanwhile, Rosie was bustling around the dining table, cutting colored paper to make a World Saver badge to gift Declan, whom she had officially declared qualified to join the Hero Club. Camille chuckled to herself, watching her daughter tape her fingers up in the process. Mumbling, "Mr. Declan has to wear a scarf and wear the badge, or he can't save anyone." Camille knew that if it weren't for the snowstorm, she'd probably hear the familiar knock around tea time. But she didn't expect anything. Not because she needed him to bring pastries or fix another socket, but because ever since Declan had entered their lives, she'd gotten used to the feeling of someone knowing the way back. Around 4 o'clock, the knock came 3 taps, soft but clear. Camille opened the door, and, like always, he was standing there. But this time, he was shivering, cheeks flushed from the cold, hair dusted with snow, and in his hands, a small paper bag wrapped in crinkled tissue and tied with a pale ivory ribbon, special delivery for the head chef and talented artist. He said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "You're soaked." "Come in quickly," Camille said, stepping aside to let him in. Rosie came bounding over, squealing. "You came. Did you bring the scarf? I made a badge too." Declan laughed, but his eyes turned to Camille. He held out the gift bag. "For you. I figured in this weather, another layer of warmth might help." Camille took it, hesitating slightly. She wasn't used to receiving gifts, especially ones given for no special reason. She opened the paper bag. Inside was a cream-colored wool scarf, thick, hand-knitted, with soft yarn and delicate crochet edging running along the sides. It wasn't luxurious in a designer boutique kind of way, but it had clearly been chosen with care. Camille froze. She reached in and touched the soft yarn, her eyes scanning the stitches. Not because of its value, but because of a memory. "This looks exactly like the scarf my mother knitted for me in 9th grade. I lost it on the subway during college. The color, the pattern, it's the same." She looked up, visibly surprised. "You remember that?" Declan nodded. His voice was quiet, sincere. "You told me that while folding laundry." "You were laughing, but when you mentioned the scarf, you paused for a second, like the memory still lived inside you." Camille tightened her grip on the scarf. She had shared that story in passing, without much thought. And yet, he had remembered. "I'm not great at remembering everything," Declan went on. "Truly, most people talk to me and 5 minutes later, I forget what they said. But with you, I remember. I don't know why." The words caught in Camille's chest. She didn't speak. She simply placed the scarf on her lap, gently running her hand along the edge. Her fingers trembled slightly. Rosie looked around, then whispered, "Is Mommy gonna cry?" "It's okay, sweetheart," Camille replied, her voice barely. Above a whisper, "Mommy just feels warm." That evening, they had stewed together. No celebration, no fireworks, just warm tea on the table. Oddly shaped ginger cookies Rosie had cut herself. And an atmosphere as gentle as breath, Camille wore the new scarf around her neck. When Rosie asked why she didn't wait until Christmas to use it, she smiled and said, "Because I don't want to wait until I need something to realize it's already precious." Declan didn't respond, but he understood. His gaze softened, like a man who'd finally found the path out of a fog-covered road. As he was leaving that night, Declan paused in the doorway. "Camille, you're the first person I want to remember." She didn't reply, but she nodded softly. Like if she opened her mouth, the emotions would spill out too quickly. That night, while tidying up Rosie's drawings to store them away, Camille stopped at a fresh sheet of paper. Rosie had drawn 3 people: a little girl, a woman in a cream-colored scarf, and a man in a long coat carrying a light bulb. Above them, in careful marker handwriting, were the words, "Our home." Camille pressed her lips together, her fingers clutching the paper a little tighter. Something had shifted inside her. Not because of the scarf, not because of any tender words, but because, for the first time in many years, she no longer felt forgotten. March arrived with lazy winds. The snow began to melt, revealing bumpy streets and puddles shimmering with sunlight. The trees were still bare, but the air carried a hint of fresh grass. For many, it was just a transitional month. But for Rosie, March was everything. She was about to turn 7. And this would be the first real birthday party of her life. Camille spent the whole morning blowing up balloons, tying ribbons, and cutting flower shapes from colored paper. On the small dining table sat a strawberry frosted cake, placed right at the center of Rosie's mini exhibition, which she had curated herself. 3 new paintings taped to the wall, each labeled in pencil: Mom, Dad, Declan, and me, the world-saving team. Today, I'll wear my silver princess dress. And Mom, you have to wear your cream scarf like on the snowy day, remember? Rosie reminded her for the 3rd time. Camille chuckled as she wiped down the table, though a quiet unease lingered in her chest. There was one name Rosie had been repeating all week with joyful anticipation. Dad Declan, he had promised. "On your birthday morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I'll be the first to knock, and I'll bring a surprise." Camille remembered that moment clearly. Rosie's tiny fingers had pinky sworn with Declan, her eyes gleaming like they held the whole world. Camille hadn't said anything then, but in her heart there was a silent fear she hadn't dared to name. Would someone leave again? 2 days before Rosie's birthday, Declan was sitting in a boardroom at a major advertising firm in Manhattan when his phone rang. An unknown number. Overseas, he stared at the screen for a moment, then excused himself to take the call. On the other end was a senior producer from an international media corporation, someone who had worked with him during his prime. "Declan, I know you've stepped away from the industry, but we want to hear your pitch for One Frame, One World. If it lands, we sign. The only thing is the Singapore partners will only meet in person, and the only available time is the morning of March 17th. Can you fly out immediately?" Declan froze. March 17th, Rosie's birthday. He could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his chest. I need to think about it." He hung up. the room went quiet. In his mind, he saw a little girl in a silver dress standing at the door. Staring out at the street, that evening, Declan called Camille. "Is something wrong?" Her voice was gentle, but he could detect the familiar undercurrent of worry. I have an unexpected meeting in Singapore. It's a huge opportunity. But it's scheduled for Rosie's birthday morning." Silence. Declan continued. "Slower now. I'm trying to reschedule. But if I can't, I might not make it back in time. I'm sorry." On the other end, Camille didn't scold. She simply said softly, "You've already done so much. But you should know, to Rosie, you're not just the guy who brings pastries or fixes lights. You're a promise. And that day, she's not waiting for gifts. She's waiting for you." Her tone wasn't angry, but it held a sadness that couldn't be masked. "I know," Declan whispered. After hanging up, he sat by the hotel window for a long time. Manhattan glimmered outside, filled with lights. But to him, everything suddenly felt meaningless. On the morning of March 17th, the little basement apartment glowed like a tiny star on the street corner. Rosie wore her silver dress, her hair braided into two neat plaits, a paper crown on her head cut by Camille. She darted back and forth, asking again and again, "What time is it now, Mom?" "Almost 8. He's probably walking up the stairs now." Camille checked the clock. Nearly 8:30. Still no knock. By 9. Rosie sat down quietly on the chair. She didn't cry. She just pressed her lips together and stared. At the door, Camille knelt beside her and pulled her close. "Maybe he got stuck in the snow, sweetheart. But we still have cake," Rosie whispered, but he promised. Camille turned her face away. She didn't want her daughter to see that her own eyes were starting to turn red at the same time. In Singapore, Declan stepped out of the conference room. The meeting had ended earlier than expected. The deal was done. Hands had been shaken. An assistant approached to confirm his dinner reservation. Declan asked only one question: "Is there any flight out of here as soon as possible?" "You want to return to New York now?" He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I have a promise to keep." Back in Boston, the small birthday party carried on simply. A few of Rosie's classmates came, played, and laughed. Camille tried to smile, but each time the hallway stirred with sound, her eyes shifted to the door. At 5 p.m., there came a knock. 3 times, soft but unmistakably familiar. Camille jumped up and opened the door. Declan stood there, tousled by wind, clothes still dusty from travel. In his hand, a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Rosie ran from inside, shouting, "Mr. Declan." He knelt and scooped her into his arms. "I promised, didn't I? I might be late, but I'm here." Camille stood at the door, her hand trembling slightly. When Declan handed her the box, he said simply, "I almost didn't make it. But in the end, I realized the place I wanted to be most wasn't a boardroom." She opened the box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, engraved with the words, "Rosie." And Camille, my home forever. Camille looked up. Her eyes were brimming with tears. Declan spoke quietly. "I never knew what a family was until you and Rosie taught me. If I may, I'd like to keep learning. From both of you." She smiled, nodding as she wiped her tears. That evening, they didn't need a big party or fireworks. Just a cake, a child's laughter, and a man who kept his word even if it meant crossing the world to do so. The little basement apartment was no longer just a home for two. Since Rosie's birthday, since the moment Declan appeared in the cold wind, holding the little girl close and offering Camille the most delicate gift a man had ever given her. Promise etched in silver and kept with heart, everything had changed. Not with grand declarations or dramatic vows, but in the quiet details, a third cup always ready at the dining table. A man's coat hanging by the door. An extra pillow placed on the couch. And most of all the silver bracelet Camille wore every day, not as jewelry, but as if it were part of her. From then on, Declan no longer just dropped by. He stayed, not in the sense of moving in entirely, but in the way someone begins to truly belong somewhere in the mornings. He arrived before Rosie left for school, just to tie her shoelaces even, though she could do it herself. He said it was their good luck ritual. In the evenings, while Camille simmered beans or rinsed paintbrushes, Declan would sit with Rosie, reading aloud from fairy tales yellowed with age, his voice deep and expressive enough to make Camille turn away sometimes just to hide a smile. And then there were the times when they did nothing at all, just sat together in the soft yellow glow of the lamp, chatting about scattered little things about the weather, about an overbaked cookie, about Camille's newest painting, or Rosie's school essay that was a little off topic, but very creative. No one gave their relationship a name. But Camille knew somewhere between those evenings Declan had become part of their family. One Saturday afternoon, while Rosie napped, Camille and Declan sat on the tiny back balcony of the apartmenta space, just big enough for 2 iron chairs and a pot of mint that had long since withered in the cold. Declan held a cup of ginger tea, occasionally sipping and frowning. The tea's a little bitter today. Camille nodded. I accidentally used old ginger. Maybe that's good. A bit of bitterness for memory's sake. He said it half jokingly, half true, then fell quiet, watching a black cat weaving through snow in the alley below. Like a lone wanderer chasing warmth, Camille spoke gently. I know what you're thinking. Do you? Yes. You're wondering if you're allowed to stay a little longer. Declan turned to look at her, his gaze direct. You think you know me that well already? No. I don't know everything. But I used to ask myself the same thing. Whether anyone ever truly wanted me in their world, or if I was just a guest allowed to visit. She gripped her teacup a little tighter and continued. Since having Rosie, I haven't let anyone stay long. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid. Afraid that one day they'd leave. And when a child gets used to someone being left behind, isn't just a wound, it's a loss. Declan went quiet. He rested his arm on the chair, tracing invisible circles with his finger. I've left people too, not on purpose, but I did. And now? He looked at Camille, his eyes deep and steady like the first time she saw him in the snow. Now, I know I don't want to leave anymore. Not because you need me, but because I need you. I need this place. I need dinners with 2 salty fish sauce and Rosie's drawings of me with bunny ears. I need a reason not to disappear. Camille didn't speak. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his. Not as someone trying to hold him back, but as someone saying, you're already here. You don't need permission anymore. That night, after Rosie had fallen asleep, Camille opened an old box from a drawer. Inside were faded photos, unsent letters, and a small piece of paper with a handwritten note. Choose love, even if it hurts. My mom wrote that, Camille said. She tucked it into my suitcase when I left home. I didn't find it until I had Rosie. Were you angry at her? I was. For a long time. But then I understood she was just a mother afraid her daughter would get hurt. She looked up at Declan, and so am I, but for the first time in my life, I think maybe pain isn't so frightening if you're not alone. Declan nodded. Then he stood, walked over to the coat closet, and pulled something from the inside Paquita photograph. He placed it on the table. This is me, 10 years old. The only vacation my family ever took together. What do you see in that boy's eyes? Camille studied the photo. A young boy with light brown hair, standing stiffly between his parents in a tiny suit. His eyes weren't exactly sad, but they held no joy either. What was he thinking? She asked. Declan gave a soft, rueful smile, that maybe if he were good enough, quiet enough, successful enough, His parents would finally notice. He paused before adding, "But they didn't. They just asked, 'Where are the grades? What's the next achievement?'" Camille didn't ask further. She simply stood and wrapped her arms around him from behind, gently like touching an old scar. "Here, you don't have to be good. You just have to be." That night, Camille didn't close her bedroom door like she usually did. She left the kitchen light on, letting it spill softly into the living room, where Declan slept under a quilt she had mended herself. She didn't say, "You can stay." She didn't ask, "Will you come back tomorrow?" Because now, every morning when she woke up, there was already someone sitting at the old wooden chair pouring tea. And each night, along with the ticking of the clock, there was the quiet sound of someone breathing, someone who no longer wanted to run. April arrived with soft sunlight and the earthy scent of early spring rain. Camille's basement apartment was still modest low ceilings, paint peeling in a few places, but something had quietly shifted, not because the furniture had changed, or the walls had been repainted, but because it was beginning to take the shape of a true home. In the kitchen, the mug rack now had an extra hook. Declan's cup read "Not all heroes wear capes," decorated by Rosie with tape and marker. On the bookshelf, nestled between children's books and art guides, was a small section of Declan's old titles, not ones he had brought over, but ones Camille had quietly found and bought from second-hand stores. No one had asked anyone to move in. Yet somehow, Declan had his own key. And Camille no longer startled at the familiar knock on the door. She knew it was family. One Friday afternoon, Camille was teaching Rosie how to paint with watercolors. The little girl pursed her lips in concentration as she carefully filled a large sheet of paper with color. Her drawing showed a small slanted roof house and three people, a man carrying a box of pastries, a woman holding a paintbrush, and a girl in a princess dress. "What are you going to name your painting?" Camille asked, gently guiding her brush. Rosie tilted her head, eyes shining. "A family of three, no papers needed." Camille froze. Her hand paused midair. She wasn't sure where Rosie had picked up that phrase, from a cartoon, maybe, or overheard in conversation. But somehow, it was the truest definition of what was unfolding in their home. No signatures. No contracts. Just a family forming through quiet dinners, bedtime stories, and Sunday mornings filled with grocery runs and laughing over picking the wrong kind of onions. Another evening, Camille came home after a shift at the coffee shop down the street. The moment she opened the door, the scent of cinnamon and butter filled the apartment. Declan was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flipping pancakes in a skillet. "Welcome home," he said, without turning around. Camille leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a slow smile blooming across her face. "You know, my kitchen used to smell like cheap soy milk and boiled vegetables. Now it smells like slightly burnt pancakes and someone muttering, 'Oh no, I mixed up the salt and sugar.'" Declan turned, his cheeks flushed. "I call it innovation. Pancake surprise, maybe?" Sounds like a dish from someone newly unemployed, learning how to live again. And you're looking at the living example. They both burst out laughing. The sound was light, unburdened, like the past had never weighed them down. That night, after Rosie had gone to sleep, Camille and Declan sat in the living room. Rain tapped gently on the low window outside. Camille pulled out a large rolled-up drawing from a paper tube and laid it on the table. "I drew this when Rosie was born, but I never dared to hang it up." Declan unrolled the drawing. It showed a woman holding a baby in her arms, surrounded by fog and blurred strokes. But at the center, there was a glow, like a candle shining from the mother's chest. He said nothing at first, just nodded, placing his hand on the corner of the drawing before looking at Camille. "Why not?" "Because I was afraid. Hanging it meant admitting I was once fragile, Lost that I used to hold my child and not know where our next meal would come from. And now I think if someone stays even after seeing you at your weakest, then maybe you don't have to hide anymore." She didn't say who she meant, but her eyes were fixed on him, unwavering. Declan didn't respond. He simply reached out and took her hand. His fingers weren't cold, but they trembled not from nerves, but from the tide of emotion rising. Inside him, Camille squeezed his hand. "No, I love you. No, I need you." Just a held hand. And that was enough. A week later, the three of them went grocery shopping together. Rosie led the way, holding the shopping list and reading aloud. Carrots for Mr. Declan, milk for Mom, cookies for Rosie Triple Check, just to be sure. The vendor looked at them and joked, "Family." Camille glanced at Declan. They exchanged a brief look. She didn't answer, just smiled. Declan held the basket and replied, "We're a work in progress." Rosie chimed in, "We're a heart family. We don't have to look alike." The vendor laughed heartily. "Well then, that's a real family." That night, Camille finally hung the old drawing on the wall, the one she had kept hidden for years. Beneath it, she placed a small inscription. "Love isn't perfection. It's choosing not to leave." And behind the frame, she tucked something else, a newly cut spare key, labeled with the initials D.H, no words, no ceremonies. Just presence, every single day. Camille had never really considered bringing Declan back to her parents' house, not because she was ashamed, but because the distance had grown too wide. Since the day she chose to keep Rosie without anyone's consent, she had left the small town she grew up in with a heart both wounded and proud. Her strict mother, her quiet father who followed silently behind, neither had ever come to Boston, nor had they ever met their granddaughter. Each year, there were only a few holiday cards and a polite birthday call. Camille no longer held anger. She didn't know where to begin again either, until one evening in early May, while coloring. Rosie asked innocently, "Mom, do I have grandparents?" The question sliced clean through Camille like a sharp pair of scissors, cutting into the part of her memory she had long buried. She didn't answer right away, just nodded gently. "Yes, but it's been a long time since we saw them." Rosie didn't ask why. She just said, "If I draw a letter with a heart on it, will you send it for me?" Camille couldn't say no to that look. She made a phone call to her hometown after 8 long years. Her mother's voice on the other end was just as dry as ever. "Hello, it's me, Camille." A brief silence. Then, unexpectedly, "Are you eating properly? Is it still cold in Boston?" Camille laughed, not at the questions, but at the tone. It wasn't an apology, but it was an opening. And so, a few weeks later, Camille decided to take Rosie and Declan back to her old home, not to ask for forgiveness, but to introduce them to her present. The bus stopped along a rural road lined with wildflowers. Rosie jumped out of her seat, teddy bear in hand, eyes sparkling. "Mom, do grandparents look like the ones in storybooks? Do they have rocking chairs and apple pie?" "Something like that," Camille answered, her heart beating a little faster. Declan was the last to step off the bus, carrying a duffel bag and a small bouquet of wild daisies he'd picked at a rest stop. "Do you think they'll like these?" he asked. Camille shook her head gently. "My dad doesn't care much. As for my mom, I honestly don't know." As they approached the old wooden house nestled between 2 aging maple trees, Camille felt like she was 22 again, standing on that doorstep, hands over her belly, torn between knocking and turning away. But this time, Declan was on her left, and Rosie held her right hand tightly. She knocked. Moments later, the door opened. Her mother, still stern, her hair now more silver than gray, stared at them. Her eyes, well, they weren't cold. "You came." Camille nodded. She was about to introduce Declan, but Rosie stepped forward first. "I'm Rosie. I drew a letter with a heart and sent it to you." The older woman looked at the little girl for a long moment. Then she reached out and took the teddy bear from Rosie's arms, asking softly, "What's its name?" "Teddy. He gets tummy aches. Do you have medicine?" A faint smile barely there flickered across her face. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in. The tea's still warm. No hugs. No tears." But Camille knew this was all her mother could offer right now, and it was enough. The afternoon passed slowly. Camille's father remained as silent as ever, but when Rosie pulled him into the garden to look for four-leaf clovers, he didn't refuse. Declan helped Camille's mother in the kitchen, even though she hadn't said much to him. Camille walked in and saw a nearly surreal scene. Declan peeling potatoes, her mother quietly boiling water beside him. The air felt awkward, but not tense. Then, unexpectedly, her mother spoke. "He's not the child's father, is he?" Camille nodded. No. But he's the one who chose to stay." A small nod. Then, a sentence so rare it felt like magic. "Then don't let someone like that slip away." Camille froze. She turned to her mother, the same woman who once screamed, "If you have that baby, don't ever come back." She wasn't saying sorry. But with that simple sentence, she acknowledged her mistake and accepted her daughter's choice. That night, after Rosie had fallen asleep on the old sofa, Camille and Declan sat on the porch steps. The moon rose high. Casting a gentle light over the quiet garden, Camille leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know, I used to think I could never come back. But once you walked away, you couldn't return to people who had turned their backs. But you came. Because I want Rosie to have roots. And because this time, I'm not coming back alone." Declan squeezed her shoulder. "And you know what? I used to think I was just a visitor, someone who came by to fix a light bulb and leave. And now," he turned to her, his gaze steady, "now I know I'm part of the picture, even if it's sketched in pencil or drawn in blood and tears." Camille nodded gently, brushing her lips to his cheek. "Not every spring smells like flowers. Some springs just need one person to come back to know that your heart has softened." Summer in Boston wasn't suffocating, just warm enough for Camille to crack open the window each morning, letting in the breeze that carried scents of the street market, cinnamon from the bakery on the corner, and the familiar clatter of streetcars that felt like the city's quiet heartbeat. The basement apartment had changed a lot. The walls were now painted a warm white. The new ivory curtains were ones Camille bought with money from selling her first painting. Rosie had a real bed now, no longer sleeping on a mattress on the floor, painted a soft lilac and decorated with cats and princess cutouts that Declan had crafted by hand. And perhaps most telling of all, the new shelf on the wall, holding 3 ceramic mugs. One read Mom, another writer with a little typewriter drawn on it, and the smallest one scribbled in marker, "Rosie's World Boss." Each morning, Camille boiled water, Declan made toast, and Rosie sat reading her self-made menu. Bored, today's breakfast, chocolate muffins, coffee for grown-ups, and orange juice for the smartest 7-year-old. No one had to say anything aloud, but everyone understood this was a family, and no one was just visiting. One June afternoon, Declan took Camille and Rosie to see a small ground-floor apartment by the riverside. It wasn't fancy, but it was bright and had a backyard. "I got the lease," he said. "The landlord agreed to let us renovate a little." Camille looked around, a slight crease between her brows. "Why'd you pick somewhere farther from your work?" Declan shrugged. "Because there's space for a little swing for Rosie. And I can set up my desk near the kitchen so I can hear you grumble when the soup's too salty." "So you're saying," I'm thinking, "it feels right to you? We could call this place home, officially." Camille froze. Not because it surprised her, but because something warm began to swell in her chest. No wedding. If you want one, we'll have it. But if not, a night with the three of us eating noodles and saying we're home, that's enough for me. Camille nodded, eyes stinging a little. She didn't need a wedding gown. She didn't need a diamond ring. She needed mornings with someone beside her boiling water. Afternoons where Rosie called them both her big buddies, and a man who said, "I'm staying every day, not out of duty, but because of love." On moving day, all three had special missions. Rosie was in charge of packing her stuffed animals after a long debate. She kept only 6. Camille packed her paintings. Declan packed his books. And the old wooden chair they had all once sat on to read stories. Their new ground floor apartment was flooded with golden light by late afternoon. Rosie ran circles in the living room, shouting, "We have a new house. Its name is the Beehive." "Why a beehive?" Camille asked. "Because 3 people squeezed in one place, living together, warm and sometimes a little noisy too." Declan burst into laughter. Camille laughed with him. Maybe no one plans on naming their home, but Rosie always had a way of defining her world in her own language. A month later, they threw a small party, not a wedding, but what Rosie called their household ceremony. They invited a few friends, neighbors, the cafe owner where Camille used to work, and some of Declan's old colleagues, people who once thought he had disappeared from life for good. Rosie was the MC, holding a plastic microphone, standing in the middle of the living room to make her grand announcement. Today is special, because it's the day Uncle Declan officially becomes Mom and Rosie's forever person. Everyone who agrees, raise your hand. The room erupted in laughter as hands shot up. Camille stood next to Declan, holding his hand. No one said, "I do." But everyone was living as if those vows had been spoken long ago. One night, after Rosie had fallen asleep, Camille and Declan sat out back. The air was cool. The moon hung still like a soft pillow in the sky. Camille rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember the day I invited you in for soup?" "Of course. Still the best soup I've ever had." "Not because I cooked well?" "No. Because for the first time in years, someone handed me a spoon and said, 'You can stay if you want to.'" They didn't need to say anything else. Camille closed her eyes, fingers lacing through his dot from a bowl of soup. A knock on the door, and a little basement apartment. They had written a story together, one without a final chapter. Because real happiness isn't found in climaxes or endings. It's found in the choice made every single day to stay, to be gentle, to reach out and hold each other's hand. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Perhaps the most precious thing this tale offers isn't romance, but something much simpler. Family doesn't need blood ties or paperwork, just people willing to stay. Every single day, if this story touched your heart. If you've ever been the one to open the door or the one invited in, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe to Snail's Story, so each week you can return for another gentle, heartwarming tale like this one.